Hello everybody and welcome back to In My Shed. Well, frames are rubbed back. Bit of wire brush work, wire wheel work, and luckily I found a spray can of rust converter for those little corners you just can't bloody get at. But I think by the end of today's work they'll be ready to paint. I thought they were heavier than they really are. I can move them about a little bit, but not as good as I used to. We'll get you around here when we're doing a bit of painting. This is a pretty interesting shot. That's what I swept up off the floor. That just come off the frames this morning. I'd say it's about nearly 2 foot square. It's about 20 inches square. Couldn't believe how much mill scale and rubbish was on those frames. But if you tried to paint on top of that, it would not stick. These are the spreaders just after being sprayed. This second can of Etch Undercoat primer is just so much heavier in density than the previous can. The previous can had almost no solids in it and the coverage was very poor. This is the fastest, lightest coat I can give it, and man, it's putting a lot of colour up there. I'll dry in a few minutes. We'll take them up to the frames and measure up and start to fit them if we can. Hello again. Look who's back. Frames up on the mill, a little bit darker, and I think it'll be easier to work on. I'm giving it a bit more scrutiny and trying to figure out more of why the frames don't go together too well. Out of all of the spreaders, this one mid-rear just drops straight in. 4 rivets go straight in. It's the right width, it's perfect, so I'll bolt that up. Bob's your uncle. This little fella that goes in here, you can push it in if you spread the frames by about 1/10 thou, I suppose. So that's going to be skimmed off, probably in the shaper, off one side. This one here that I did have bolted in is too wide for the frames. Now the frames are held apart by cylindrical squares at the correct dimension. So I've just put the verniers over it. It's about 4 or 5 thou narrower at the bottom than it is at the top. I can sneak this in underneath, but it just gets tight as it gets closer. So I'll put that up on the shaper and take a few thou off each side as well to get that centralised up. I'll try the rear spreaders to try and get everything to fit a little bit better than it was. So I can now see why the spreader here was giving me so much grief. None of the other spreaders were a correct dimension, and only by a few thou, but it must have had the frame in a hell of a lot of tension as you tighten up the screws. So that's a bit more history. I've got them cleaned down, first coat of primer on them, and ready to start to machine things and reassemble. So I'll measure up and then bring you back when we've got the shaper set up. I'm using the shaper, well, because the mill's occupied, but also I only want to take a couple of thou, and the shaper's very, very good at that. The mill is with a fly cutter, but it's being used. Back again in my shed. The frames are off the mill, and that's the rear spreader up there at the moment. I'm having a closer look, and I'm coming up with more and more small errors, and all of those errors are cumulative. So at the moment I've got the best registering side of the spreader down on the bottom of the vise. It's the one that's square to the drawbar angle, which is on the left hand side, and I'll take that beam of wood out in a minute and show you the setup. Just a 1, 2, 3 block and a parallel in behind to hold it. I can only take a thou or so off at a cut because it's such an ungainly structure, and I want to measure once I get this side parallel to the other to see how much more has to come off. But I was getting the most atrocious squealing, and that's why I clamped this piece of wood to it, and I'm still only taking light cuts, but it brought the noise down to a point where I can actually do something. So I'll give you a demo. I'm only dialing in a couple of thou. There's still a little bit to go. But I've got about 85% so far. And yes, the cutter is a little bit out of tram. We just call it a two-stage cutter. I think one more cut will bring it up to about 95% and that'll be good enough. Okay, we're off to work. Not quite. Let's see what it's like this time. Oh geez, that's about 99%, that'll do mate. One more back and I'll show you the clamping setup. Just a little parallel in behind, up above the rivet line, so I'm clamping about here on the other side of the plate, and a 1, 2, 3 block in here. Dead easy. But it is a bit of a ringing affair. There you are, a bit of a close-up. Okay, I'll measure up and see what I've got to take off the other side. I'm trying to make everything fit a little bit better. There's probably 6 or 7 errors here. There are only a few thou each. But cumulative, they were just putting the right hand side of the frames under a lot of stress, and so it was bowing out. Little bit by little bit, I'll get it straight. Bye for now. Well, the first spreader's machined. I cleaned the second side up using the first machine side as the true side down on the vise, and I then used the DTI off the quill, using the peck of the quill to dial in one side vertical to the base of the vise, and I machined off the T-piece of the spreader with about a 95% clean-up rate. And quite good. It now comes up square. It's amazing. You use a square, you think it's really square, put the DTI on and it shows you're telling lies. I'll zoom you in on that bit of plate with some history. Zoom a little closer. I hope it's good enough to see. You might just pick up a little bit of bronze colour around those holes. Originally the holes weren't very good in place, so I countersunk them on both sides, migged them up with silicon bronze, and then put the holes back in again to get the accuracy up. And that's a technique you can use to save a piece of plate like that might have 3 or 4 hours work in it, and you make a 3-second boo-boo and put the holes in the wrong place. Just countersink both sides very deeply, mig it up with silicon bronze. That takes about 10 minutes. Machine it, save the part. Very good. Bye for now. Please like and subscribe. Well, that's the result of half a morning's work. 3 of the spreaders on size and a damn sight more accurate than they were. Just had to put a bit more primer on there before I assemble them. I'm a bit surprised with the variation in the variations. They weren't all too thou out, and I'm really suspicious that I left these parts unfinished because it's about 5 years since I built them. And I put them in without bringing them to size. That's the only thing I can possibly think of. Back then I was using a little Douglas 11-inch shaper and a AL 320B lathe. The equipment wasn't actually flash. The shaper was okay, but the vise was a bit crooked. So now, happy with these. I've tried them in the frames. I'm sure I'll be able to get it a little bit straighter and more to size. Back with it as it progresses.